Tatu, and I will be moderating today's Fields of the Future speaker series exploring climate finance and climate change. To share a little bit about me, I'm working in the climate change group at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. My role is currently focused on implementing an organization-wide rollout of Paris alignment across all World Bank projects globally, which started on July 1st. Prior to joining the international development space, I worked in the banking center, focusing on treasury management solutions for corporate 100 companies. The Fields of the Future speaker series is a collaboration between many Jamaati institutions in the United States and Canada, including Aga Khan Education Board, the Climate Change Portfolio, and the Ismaili Professionals Network. We hope that this series provides insights as you explore career paths, innovation, and opportunities in selected fields of the future. I am very, very pleased and excited to introduce you to our speaker for today, Fhaeem Noor Ali. Fhaeem Noor Ali is one of 4 global climate finance trade commissioners with Global Affairs Canada and is based out of Washington, D.C. He works closely with decision makers and project managers at multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, and with a number of climate finance partners in Latin America and the Caribbean. He also hosts Understanding Climate Finance, a podcast that focuses on access to climate finance for developing countries. Prior to joining the Trade Commissioner Service, Fhaeem worked at the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation on access to finance and entrepreneurship projects focused on development finance, climate business, and innovation. He also led an agribusiness incubator in Tanzania and co-founded and sold a food tech startup in the Washington, D.C. area. Now, I invite Fhaeem Noor Ali to tell us about climate finance and climate change and his career path. Fhaeem will also share how he believes the field will evolve and discuss career opportunities for professionals and businesses. Over to you, Fhaeem.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you so much to the Fields of the Future team for having me as a part of this series. I'm really very excited to share my perspectives on this and quite honored to be asked to present. So with that, Again, I'm really honored to be here. My name is Fhaeem Noor Ali. I actually work in Washington, D.C. at the Embassy of Canada, and I am a trade commissioner, which is one of Canada's longest serving services for Canadian exporters and businesses. My role within the Trade Commissioner Service is actually pretty unique. I'm one of 4 trade commissioners that focuses exclusively on climate finance. And I'll go into that a little bit more, but effectively it's business development for Canadian businesses that want to do some sort of climate business in emerging markets. My region of responsibility is specifically South America and the Caribbean. My other colleagues focus on Europe and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia, respectively. But by being in Washington, D.C. and being close to Jenny and the World Bank, I do work quite a bit on global projects to see how we can get Canadian companies funded. As part of my job as well, I founded and host a podcast called Understanding Climate Finance. This was a way for me to bring investors to our Canadian clients during the pandemic when nobody was traveling, but it's scaled up quite a bit, and we've had a number of interesting climate investors and policymakers share their perspectives on climate finance and what that means globally for investors and for entrepreneurs going forward. So I thought I would start the presentation with some context. I mean, clearly you know that we're in a climate crisis. Otherwise you wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be interested in this subject. And you can't avoid knowing that there is one. I mean, this last summer was, I think, the hottest summer on record. And, we have constantly seeing in the news natural disasters just proliferating around the world. So you've heard the terms 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And so what does that mean? These are referring to global temperatures increases since the pre-industrial times or industrial revolution. So this graph shows how much our global temperatures have accelerated, particularly over the last 40 years. And right now, we are, according to NASA, at about 1.1 degrees. So we're really closing in at this 1.5 degree Celsius mark. And so it's imperative for anybody working in climate, regardless of your subsect or sub area, to really understand what we're up against. And I think to provide you some context as to what that means, if we hit 1.5 degrees, this is what Dubai would look like. But if we can address that a little bit better and cut pollution, then this is what it will look like. Same thing for Washington, D.C. This is what happens when we hit 1.5 degrees. And lastly, for Victoria, British Columbia. So you'll see from all of these pictures and context that, reaching that path is, reaching 1.5 degrees is going to be critical. And it's not a straight line. So when we reach 2 degrees, it's actually an exponential, the effects are exponential once we go further into 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees. So it's very important and critical that we do that. And so let me give you some time context as well. So those of you who are old enough, you'll remember 26 years ago was the last episode of Seinfeld. And it was when Google actually launched. And of course, we're all dependent on Google to search for anything that we want to. And that was in 1998. 6 years ago was the royal wedding of Prince Harry, and where the Me Too movement really built its momentum, and it was front and center. And the reason I share this is because in 6 years, these are our goals to be Paris alignment. So the Paris alignment asks that we increase the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius and above pre-industrial levels, and pursue to limit the temperature to 1.5 degrees, and to increase the ability to adapt and adverse impacts of climate change and foster climate resilience, and to make sure that finance flows consistently have a pathway for low greenhouse gas emissions. So what this means is that by 2030, according to the UN, we must limit our global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's in 6 years. In order to limit to 1.5 degrees, they must peak at 2025, so that's effectively in a year from now, and then decline by 43% by 2030. And by 2050, in 26 years, we need to be at net zero carbon emissions. But even in our current trajectory, we are facing about 1.2 billion climate migrants by 2050. So these are people that are displaced from their homes because it is uninhabitable due to climate change. So what is climate finance? There are a number of different definitions, and the unique thing about climate finance is that it's just finance. And it's going to be increasingly just finance going forward, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But the way that it's defined now by the OECD is it's local, national, and transnational financing. And by the way, this is the definition that the Trade Commissioner Service also uses for climate finance. It can be drawn from public, private, and alternative sources, and aimed at climate change mitigation and adaptation projects and programs in developing countries. And the reason that this definition specifically focuses on developing countries is because developing countries are the ones that are really, particularly the smaller islands, the most adversely affected by climate change, and really have the hardest road to recovery or adaptation to climate change overall. So I wanted to share this just to show how climate finance would sort of flow. And if you look at it, while dedicated climate finance does exist, such as in the Global Environment Facility and Green Climate Fund, it's circulated more broadly through development finance, the development finance ecosystems. And a lot of it comes from private capital and from budgets of your tax-based budgets, basically, your tax revenues. They go through national public institutions, they go through private investors. In fact, the largest amount of funding actually does go through private investors. And the instruments that are used range all the way from grants to equity. So that can be debt, that can be cheaper or subordinate or concessional debt, risk mitigation coverage. And then, of course, there are revenue streams with carbon offsets as well. So just further as to what this climate finance looks like, this is a graph that the Climate Policy Institute has put out, and they're a very good research organization that I would encourage you to look into as you're looking more into climate finance. But you will see that it's the commercial financial institutions and the corporations that provide, and the National Development Finance Institution that provide most of the funding for climate finance. And a lot of it will go into project level market rate debt. So what this means is this will go into projects such as wind or solar and providing debt to build out a solar power plant in Uganda, for example. What the uses are actually largely for mitigation. And mitigation finance and adaptation finance are very important concepts within climate finance. And mitigation basically looks at how can we try and get our levels to that 1.5 degree and 2 degree level. Adaptation is, okay, well, the climate is already changing. We're bracing for the worst. How do we adapt for the climate? How do we build out our infrastructure? And as of 2020, a lot of this mitigation finance went into energy systems. So I mentioned solar, wind, offshore. There's a lot of interest right now in hydrogen. But then we also have building and infrastructure, transport, all of those uses that provide, that put carbon into the air. How can those, we change that around a little bit? So when we look at here, we're actually well below where we need to be as far as providing climate finance. And our supply of finance does not follow the need. And as we go to 2050, which was one of those critical milestones that I mentioned earlier, we are well below the 14 billion that we need. Sorry, the 14 billion that we need. And so I think this should also sort of highlight the fact that we really need to step up as to where we want to have our climate finance go into. And so when you look at 2020, this also sort of shows what our gaps are. The graph on the right shows what's committed, but the real value, what's the real money behind it, is actually represented in the yellow, and it's quite small compared to what we need for mitigation, which is represented in the orange, and what we need for loss and damage and adaptation, which is in the purple and blue, respectively. What we need as far as mitigation finance and adaptation finance is quite significant, and in this graph on the left, our financing gap is quite significant as well. So this is also sort of things to sort of take into context. To put it into numbers, our annual climate finance needs through developing countries through 2030 is $1.7 to $3.4 trillion. And we've only provided about $250 billion. These are figures from the IFC and IMF, or the International Monetary Fund. And only 2.2% of that is actually going to adaptation finance, whereas we need a significant amount more going into adaptation finance. So then, what is the role, in this case, of the multilateral finance institutions? And like I had said, my job focuses on business development with Canadian companies to address the multi-finance institutions. So certainly the multi-finance institutions are not the only source of climate finance, but is the source of climate finance that I'm the most familiar with, and I work with the most. So here are some examples of some of the multilateral development banks that provide financial assistance to developing countries for economic and social development. So we have the Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank, CAF in Europe, the World Bank, of course, the Inter-American Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, Africa. These are all sort of multilateral banks. We also have, work with bilateral development banks as well. And the way that they provide their funding is through contracts, so through procurement, and then also through investment. And that investment could even range, like I said earlier, into low-cost loans and to grants to client countries. And the way that they are distinct is that there's sovereign lending, so it's lending to government. So that's largely what the World Bank does, and IDB, and some of the other development banks I asked. So they'll provide funding according to a 5-year strategy that they've co-developed with a certain country, and provide lending to the Department of Finance in each of those countries, who then would deploy that loan to the relevant agency. And then, of course, there's private sector lending. So the International Finance Corporation, IDB Invest, IDB Lab, which are both part of the Inter-American Development Bank, will provide that largely debt financing. They do equity financing too, but it's mostly debt, and work alongside other global investors for infrastructure projects. So many of you may be familiar with the Bujagali Dam in Uganda that was partly financed through the IFC. And of course, Asia Development Bank and Africa Development Bank also work in both these areas. And a lot of climate finance that goes through these multilateral development banks goes through conduits such as funds. And so we have large funds which were based off of the United Nations financial mechanisms, such as the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, where they provide funding through accredited agencies, and it's basically a network where they deploy funding to make sure that the funding is used appropriately and toward climate overall. And then there are funds within some of these institutions, like the IFC has the Infra Ventures, which goes into traditionally more earlier stage companies and provides them support. We have blended finance funds. So in Canada provides blended finance money to IFC and to the Inter-American Development Bank in climate change programs. And we have different funds for agriculture and etc. So if you look at our climate commitments overall, they have gone up, which is encouraging. These are also, again, 2020 numbers. They are significantly more right now, particularly after the last series of COPs. But like I said in an earlier slide, it doesn't meet the demand that we have for climate finance. And you'll see here that it's the World Bank and the Asia Development Bank and the European Investment Bank that are really providing a large amount of funding for climate finance overall, particularly to lower and middle income economies. So looking at what are our climate finance challenges going forward, I think part of it is that when we're looking at climate finance decisions that are made at COP, or the Conference of Parties, normally you need a consensus, which means everyone needs to be on board. And so when you listen to the news and say X country or Y country at the last minute decided not to do coal, change the wording on coal investing, or this is because this creates a big challenge, because in you're mostly used to majority rules. Here, it's everybody needs to do it. The advantage here is that if everyone says yes, then everyone will, in theory, follow through with it. But it slows the decision making down on what we need for climate finance overall. The other challenge is that it's really difficult to attract funding into climate adaptation. And adaptation, like I said earlier, is that sort of funding that is needed to adapt to changing climate. So maybe that's building up bigger seawalls, building out better buildings that are hurricane resistant. And from an investment perspective, a traditional investment perspective, it's not as attractive. Your return on investment isn't really that great. You'll have to wait a long time to get your return on investment. And in an environment now where your interest rates are over 6%, your cost of capital really, from an investment perspective, exceeds the return on investment from an adaptation project. So this is where we need governments through multilateral development banks and others to provide some of that concessional funding, blended finance, and other sort of instruments to help push these companies to, basically push the climate agenda forward. The other challenge in climate finance is that investors have a hard time pricing risk. And so sometimes they price it a little too high. And this is particularly true in developing countries because there's other factors that sort of come into play as well. And so, this sort of makes that a loan would be over 20% for a climate project, which, in a large part is not very, very sustainable. And so what this means is, to my last point here, is that there's a greater need for blended and concessional financing to bring in the private sector. And the idea of sort of bringing this money in is for every dollar or so that IFC sort of puts in, or the World Bank Group puts in, we want to see at least $4 come in for the private sector. And so the development banks need to take a position in the investment where they're taking most of the risk. They're providing some sort of financing, like blended finance, where maybe they'll take 2% off that loan. You don't want to say in a 24% environment to provide 12% loans, for example, because you also have to be careful about disrupting the financial markets. So that's a whole other area of discussion. But if you follow some of these principles, you want to make sure that you're enticing the investors enough so that they don't have to price their risk so high because somebody else is taking the risk. So overall, that's sort of my quick perspectives on climate finance overall. I'll quickly sort of go into my career and what I've done to get into this field. I would say that my career has been a little bit non-traditional. I actually started my career in public relations. I started at Ogilvy Public Relations looking at healthcare, and then moved over to another public relations firm, which is part of the Publicis Group. And the reason I put that in there was, while my interest has always been development finance from a young age, the public relations part was really important to me, and I still use the tools that I used in public relations in my job now, as far as how do you present information. A lot of information, I'm sure many of the people listening and watching can relate to this, the information within our own jobs, whether you're an engineer or whether you're a financial professional, can be very esoteric, and the terms that you use will only be understood by you and your colleagues. And so having that public relations skill set and sort of crossing that bridge to making sure that everybody understands what's going on is really important. And hopefully I've been able to do that today through the presentation. From there, I moved on to the World Bank. I actually did my role at the World Bank was much more technology focused, but on the sidelines of that job, I actually got to lead a youth organization within the World Bank that looked at providing funding to youth focused projects. So that was really exciting, and I really made that 2 years at the World Bank really meaningful to me on top of the work that I was doing. From there, I pursued my MBA at Northwestern University, and then went back to the World Bank as a consultant, and so worked as a consultant for several years between the World Bank and the IFC, which of course is part of the World Bank. And as a consultant, it also afforded me the time to have a venture on the side. So as Jenny mentioned, I had co-founded a startup called Cooknook, and grew that and then sold that to a competitor. So that period was really interesting because I could use some of the entrepreneurial skills from the Cooknook side and apply it to my work at the World Bank and IFC, where I was actually specializing in designing competitions, internal competitions. So I launched between the IFC and the World Bank 3 competitions and helped to manage and scale those up. And these competitions were much like, if you're familiar with X Prize, providing funding to people within the World Bank and IFC to put money toward their projects. My last job at the World Bank was actually helping build out climate incubators around the world, called climate innovation centers. And so, first designing the competition to help design those from the ground up, and then seeing how those can be executed. And that's really how I first got into climate, was using this competition experience and seeing how I could use that to build out these innovation centers. Following that, I actually moved to Tanzania and shifted to agriculture and led the AIC, their Agribusiness Innovation Center. They were, I suppose, a client of the group of the World Bank that I was working with. But I left the World Bank to be a director there. And that experience was actually really valuable to me because I got to go into different parts of Tanzania. I was living in the middle of the country in Morogoro, and then traveling around and meeting different agribusiness processors who were looking at how they can get milk to the market, how could they could even get ice to the market, and looking at what are their barriers to doing that, and then looking at how our parent company could provide them loan guarantees to make sure that happens. I ended up staying there for a short amount of time and moving back to Washington, and after a while did get this job that I'm currently in now with the government of Canada. And this job sort of matched everything that I had done in the past: the agricultural experience, networking with the World Bank and IFC. All of those sort of come into play as to into my role now, and I've been in this role for about 5.5 years. So, for those that sort of are looking at climate finance overall, I would venture to say climate finance is just finance. It's not. There's nothing specific about it. Because climate's going to touch everything at some point. It's going to touch education. It's going to touch transportation. It touches infrastructure. And so I think, while the distinction is made between climate finance and finance, I think that distinction is becoming closer and closer and closer. And so for those of you that are in finance, I would venture to say at some point your jobs are going to evolve into climate finance. If you're in business development, you're going to have some sort of climate considerations looking into climate as well. So as I mentioned, my job is largely a business development role where I talk to funders about Canadian companies, and seeing how I can help Canadian companies put their best foot forward. So in preparation for these introductions, I talk to companies about what are their funding needs, what is their track record, do they have agreements in place that the IFC or IDB would want to look at as part of the due diligence before I make these introductions. And of course, I mentioned the podcast as well. So the podcast part is actually interesting because it helps, not only helps Canadian companies understand, what these investors are looking at, but it also helps me go deeper into my research to understand what they're looking at too as I'm preparing for these podcasts. So my typical week will look at, something related, and of course there's administrative work too. Something related to, one of these three aspects, where it's research, or it's talking to these institutions about Canadian companies, or getting intelligence from these institutions as to what their priorities are going forward, and then having phone calls and video calls with companies to understand how they can, if they are a good fit, and when they can start talking to these companies. My job also has a lot of travel associated with it, where I get to meet both investors and companies on the sidelines of events and providing them information. Like I said earlier, climate finance is a multidisciplinary field, and I think professionals from various backgrounds can contribute to its growth. How do you prepare for a job in climate finance? I think part of it is looking at some sort of certifications. I have a different slide on certifications later on. I think those are always helpful, but in providing you education, I don't know at this point if it's necessary, to get a job as a qualifier, particularly because there's a larger need for people who understand green skills than there is a supply. So just demonstrating that those skills is important. But the CFA Institute has an ESG investing course, which I've started, which I find very good. And the CFA Institute, many of you might be familiar with it for their other certification programs as well. Building out technical knowledge is also very important. As you get into climate finance, I talked earlier about a risk, and so understanding, how does solar work, how do systems work, what are the emerging projects, all make are all significant in understanding how you can invest overall. Networking is critically important. Because what you need to do is understand who all the other players are in the field. In New York, right before the UN General Assembly, they have Climate Week. Around the world, in London, they have it as well. And that's where you find that a lot of investors match up. They find companies to invest in, and where a lot of the work happens, and where the transactions happen, and where a lot of the hiring happens is through just networking. So I think that's critically important. Having project management skills, like any other job, is really important as well, because you have to be able to multitask and be able to understand what the different projects are. Carbon accounting, I think, as we look at the business side of climate, how do we understand carbon credits? How do we understand what carbon accounting is? How do we make sure that we're not greenwashing all of this, and we're not double counting? I think that's an important skill to develop. And data science, as we go into deep tech, data science is also going to be critically important as well, to understand really where that technology and climate can overlay on top of each other, and make sure that that we're being impactful in sort of the really deep technical issues, such as hydro, such as battery cells, such as all the other technology that's sort of coming out that's going to help the climate overall. So to that end, some of the career advice that I would sort of suggest is make sure that you embrace random and diverse work experiences and work paths. I explained my own, where I started in public relations. I did a little bit of IT work, a little bit of agriculture work. And I think all of those sort of contribute to what you can bring back into any career, and particularly into climate finance. For those of you that really want to get deep into it, and have the opportunity to do it, I would say try and get transaction experience as early and as often as possible. I know it's really tough earlier in career or even post MBA to try and get that project transaction experience, particularly in an international context. But any sort of experience you can have, I think, is what you can leverage going forward. Because if you can understand how the companies tick, how to evaluate a company, how to understand some of the pitfalls, I think that's going to be invaluable as you look at climate investing and climate finance going forward. And then keep up with climate knowledge, news, and innovations. There's lots of newsletters out there. LinkedIn is a valuable source. Lots of people in your own network, you'd be surprised, are working in climate, and you'll probably see a lot more of it working in sustainability and working in climate. And just sort of keep up with some of these social media parts of it. And I mentioned the Climate Policy Institute. There are a number of other government and non-government publications that come out for climate finance specifically. All of the multilateral development banks put out a yearly report on climate finance where they talk about where money is being deployed and where it's not being deployed. And I think it's a very good one. And you'll see that each of these large institutions provide a copy of that report on their websites. As I mentioned, certification it certainly helps. Here are some examples of certifications that I got from somebody I follow on LinkedIn on sustainability accounting, greenhouse accounting. There are online courses offered through Yale, through American University, and others that provide you an idea of what that sort of accounting needs. Columbia University also has a very good program on climate. They have a climate school, and so they talk about climate communications, climate finance, carbon accounting. So I think going into all of these online courses is really important. It's encouraging to see that some of these master's programs also will offer a dual MBA and environment program, or a master's, because they sort of see where this intersection is really important. So the certification certainly is there, and I think it's worth pursuing, and a lot of it is free, and sometimes you can even get your employer to pay for some of it. Companies are much more aware of what ESG means, and so asking them to pay for an ESG course, I don't think would be considered unreasonable. So I thought I would end this presentation with a quote from Wangari Korea. So in our local language, Kiswahili, global warming literally translates to alarm, alarm. The world is on fire. So this is something the whole world needs to hear. And I think this was a profound quote, because this is really where we are. And so if we can sound the alarm on this and get more people interested and activated in becoming activists, and not only doing their part to mitigate the climate, but we're doing their part to see how we can make this as part of our internal DNA and not see it as a separate sustainability initiative or a philanthropic initiative, then we'll be on our path to sort of not seeing some of the climate issues that I highlighted earlier. So with that, thank you everybody for listening and for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Super. Thank you so much, Fhaeem, for enlightening us in a very short period of time on climate finance. That is no easy feat. So we very much enjoyed hearing about the breadth of the field and its connection to the environment, but most importantly to career opportunities and to how it touches a lot of the topics that we're already working on. I'm going to start, Fhaeem, with some technical questions and some technical clarifications, perhaps. And then we'll punt over to some career and professional development questions that have come in. And so if that works for you, then we'll go down that path. You've mentioned a couple of times, or at least a couple, but maybe a few times, that climate finance is really finance, and many people have found that to be quite a thoughtful but confusing statement. And so can you perhaps spend a minute or so helping to explain what you mean by that? Particularly given, if one is perhaps in the field of finance, but maybe didn't focus perhaps a degree or isn't necessarily working in a climate related space, what does that mean? And how can somebody really think about, pivoting or engaging in this, in the climate space if they're solely working in finance?
Yeah, certainly. So, I'll provide an example. So, 25 years ago, no one would invest into into solar plants, and solar energy overall. That was seen as a climate finance, a very distinct part of investing. Now you'll find that a lot of funders will go into climate, and it's not seen as something distinct from what they had done in the past. It's now just a traditional part of their portfolio. I think the same thing goes with other sources of energy. You look at transport. You look at Tesla in electronic vehicles, for example. This is not something that's seen as special. Like when you go and you fund your car, it's no longer just an EV funding, finance, or it's car finance. And so that's what I sort of mean is that, when we look at finance overall, we're going into that trajectory where it's just going to be part of everybody that's working in finance. It's going to be part of your role. If you're doing work with treasury, ESG and green bonds and blue bonds are all going to be part of the products that you offer to other institutions and that you'll be fundraising for.
Super, thanks, Fhaeem. Related to that, there are a few questions that are rolling in around the role of private sector, and I'm gonna talk about points of entry, not just in the private sector, but in general in just a moment. But one question is really along the lines of investment returns. And while you can look at international development organizations and others, by design, they are going to invest in projects and in hard and soft infrastructure that may not have a return that a private sector organization or company is looking for. And so based on your experience, not just in your role now, but perhaps in your career, what is an ideal range of investment return that the private sector can be looking at? And I know that's a very broad question. And so are there particular subfields that private sector investors can look into that may financially as well as environmentally incentivize the desire to invest?
Oh, I think there are. And again, I'm going to pick a disclaimer. These are only my own opinions. I used the energy example earlier, right? So now you'll get a commercial sort of rate of return. Of course, the context is different, right? Of what country you're doing it, what's your source of energy, what does your power purchase agreement look like, et cetera, et cetera. I think energy will continue to be a sector where there's going to be a lot of interest and you'll get good returns. I think looking at critical minerals and well, not even critical minerals specifically, but energy storage. So, are we looking at batteries? Are we looking at different kinds of, underground storage? Those are all going to be really important. What's going to power your EV? What's going to power your home? Those are all going to have, good returns going forward. There are cutting edge sort of technologies that we can look at. Hydrogen fuel cells. Where's those all of those things coming down the pipeline where your car is now going to emit water vapor rather than carbon is a really sort of exciting proposition. But you know, you need enough research to do that.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Fhaeem. You mentioned developing countries just a couple minutes ago, and it's been peppered in throughout your presentation today. Can you speak to any differences that you've observed between developed and developing countries in the context of accessing climate climate related finance as well as investments in this space?
Yeah, it's been challenging, partly because of this in my opinion at least, the risk part of it, or understanding the risk part of it. So, I mean, there are some developing countries that have attracted more finance overall. I would say they're sort of developing slash middle income countries. South Africa has attracted a lot of energy investment, for example. But if you look into the lower and middle income countries, there's a number of challenges from a macroeconomic perspective and even from a local perspective, which are tough, right? So you have currency fluctuation. What does your power purchase agreement, and I keep going back to power because that's just sort of my default and that's where a lot of the clients are. Are you being paid in dollars or are you being paid in the local currency? And so these are all factors that affect how you can invest in developing countries, on top of how do you get the money in, how do you get the money out, what is the local skill set to support this? Like, are there enough people within Senegal who can be engineers for a solar plant, or it can fix a fleet of boats or cars that are using batteries? So I think all of those factors, education, repatriation, all of those are risks that you look at going into developing countries. And there are instruments out there that provide you some sort of guarantees or insurances to make sure that large investors are protected. But still, it's challenging and it's priced into the risk.
Sounds good. Thanks, Fhaeem. In a previous session, there was conversations related to carbon markets, carbon pricing, those kind of elements, which fall within the broader umbrella of climate finance. What role do you think, or do you see carbon credits playing in the climate finance world?
I think it'll play an important role. So I'll give I'm working with a client right now that is looking to do reforestation in the Peruvian Amazon. And part of I would qualify it as an impact investment project because they're going to work with farmers and do a revenue share. But part of the revenue is going to be carbon credits. So they're going to sell the carbon credits from the reforestation back to large companies who are like, there literally isn't enough supply of carbon. I mean, it's a whole other discussion, but the whole carbon market isn't quite well defined, or very well defined in my opinion right now. But there's going to be a huge need. This is going to be a big commodity, and there isn't enough of this commodity to go around. So I think it'll be a really significant revenue source going forward.
Sounds good. Thanks, Fhaeem. Another question, there's a couple of questions that have come in. As you know, we have people who have joined the session from all over the world. There are people who are in this session who are really wanting to be a part of the solution, but have commented that a lot of times the feedback that's coming in is that it's really hard to access funds at the local level. And even kind of as you talk about your role in your current job, I just wanted to ask, how can people access opportunities, projects, funds in order to support in order to support their community on the ground?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not easy. So if you look at some of the projects or the clients that I work with, they have to wait a year or more, to from an introduction to the time they actually secure finance, which isn't really sustainable for local organizations or small and medium enterprises that are cash flow tight. So it gets challenging. So that big money sort of comes with the cost of time. So that can be a little bit tough. Small and medium enterprises, you know, they will probably need to work with some of their local financial institutions. So one of the ways that these large organizations try and address this is that they'll provide some sort of loan or some sort of financing to a fund that will then go to a local finance institutions like Citizens Bank in Kenya, and then they'll have some sort of part of their portfolio that needs to go into green financing. But the other challenge there is that is the lending part, right? So a lot of times when you want to be part of the climate solution, your immediate need is the climate adaptation part. And like as I mentioned, that adaptation part isn't very investable. It's reactive. And so it's just finding that grant funding and that grant money to do it. Someone relate to this question. It's not directly answering the question, but one challenge here is that there isn't a lot of funding available for scoping and design funding. There isn't a lot of design funding available. And so when companies and organizations are trying to scope out a problem, finding that money to say, oh, okay, I need funding to address X problem or Y problem, it's hard to find it without a clear for investors to fund that without a clear pathway to or sightline to investment. So I'm sorry, I didn't have a very good answer for that, or that could address it. But I understand that it can be an issue. But I would say work with their local financial institutions and see if they can work with other institutions to get it, because it really is a trickle down.
Sounds good. Thanks, Fhaeem. I know it wasn't an easy question, and a lot of these aren't, and so thank you for your transparent and candid conversations and responses. I'm going to pivot now to some of the career questions that have rolled in. So you kind of talked about this, so maybe in case there's anything that you kind of wish you said, but for students interested in similar jobs that you've had, ranging from PR to the World Bank, and in your role at the embassy now, what skills and opportunities would you recommend for someone to pursue now? So yes, you went to get your MBA. I wonder if in today's MBA programs and today's master's programs that are not directly climate or environmentally titled, are they covering a lot of content? Are there climate finance courses now that are that you can elect to take or that are mandatory in some of these MBA programs, for example? But if you were to kind of do this again, what skills would you focus on?
Yeah, so the skills that I would learn or relearn, I think the communication skills are really important. I think that's where public relations, I sort of stumbled into it. It wasn't something that I was actually pursuing, but I'm glad I sort of fell into it. Because the ability to tell a story, no matter what industry you're in, right? To tell a story and make sure that people can subscribe to it and understand it, I think it is really important. Otherwise, you just get stuck in your silo and in your technical area, and you're not really crossing any bridges or any sort of crossing into other career paths. I had mentioned, for those that really want to get into the financial part of it, any kind of transactional experience is really important, because your ability to look at a company, evaluate a company, look at the qualitative parts of it and the quantitative parts of it, I think are really important. And like I said, it is challenging, but anything that you can sort of get, even if it isn't climate related or if it isn't developing market related, and then you build into that. I think if you can do that often earlier in your career, I think it's important. And the way you do that is just how you have to be persistent. You have to sort of be hungry, and you have to. It's not going to be handed to you. Like these opportunities, you just have to say, okay, I'm interested in this, and demonstrate even in your own time what you can, how you can do it. I think, like with skill sets, like I mentioned, like the communications and the project management, even if you volunteer in a large organization or a community where you're showing those examples of that, I think go a long way is as far as then translating that into a career. So overall, I would say my advice for people starting out their career are, learn the communication side of it. Try and get, just hustle to get the transaction experience if you're wanting to get into the finance side, and just network. And I think networking is really important, and networking can be going to a meetup, going to a social event, or just doing your own startup, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit.
Thanks, Fhaeem. So you started that sentence, your last sentence, with "for those of you starting in a career." What about, and the feedback could be the same, but what about somebody who is mid-career, who is looking to pivot? I mean, you've done like so many different things in the last 10 or 15 years. So what advice do you have for a mid-career professional trying to pivot into this space, whether they have a background in finance or not?
Well, I mean, I would consider myself lucky that I've been able to pivot, but I think the networking part of it is really important, and I've been fortunate to have mentors and advocates that I've always relied on within my own family and outside. So my father was a great advocate and provided me great advice because he was in the development field. I have former bosses for the World Bank that I still keep in touch with, that provide me really good and sage advice. And I think having, for those mid-career professionals, specifically to your question, look at your network, look at who can be your mentor. And your mentor could be somebody younger than you, that can give you a perspective on what your skill sets are, because I don't think often we appreciate what our own skills are and what we can do, and so or where our gaps are, and so having that external person sort of give you an audit or give you the encouragement, I think is really important. So rely on your network, and once you realize what your skills are, then you can see how that can be applied. So if, let's say, you are working at a pharmaceutical company, I'm just sort of the top of my head, if you're working in a pharmaceutical company as a researcher, you have analytical skills, you know how to dig deep into numbers, understand big data. All of that's going to be really important when you're looking at carbon accounting and ESG and other aspects. So I think those are all areas where you can sort of translate that into.
Okay, thanks, Fhaeem. And my last question that we'd like to ask you is, you've taken a lot of, it seems to me like you've taken a lot of risks throughout your career, and you've in entrepreneurship, from the private sector, different sectors, development, moving to Illinois, getting your MBA, you've done a lot of things. What convinced you, or what made you feel comfortable taking those risks and knowing that, you'd be okay at the end of it?
Yeah, it was scary. But like I said, that my family, my mentors, people that have sort of been in my corner, that have encouraged me, and whose opinion I've respected, really made that transition easier, and helped me want to take on those risks and follow my desires. I think, um, and this is my personal bias, if you have an inclination to do a business or start a business, and you you look at your life and you're like, okay, well, if it doesn't go well, I can still pivot. Then I think you should do it, because it's such a, even if you don't make the money and you don't, business doesn't scale, the skills that you build are so important. If, let's say, for example, like, you have to fundraising is the hardest thing to do when you have a startup. And if you can say, I fundraised, or I know how to fundraise, and I know how to do business development, and I any employer would sort of take that up, because that sales experience, in that ability to put yourself out there. And I think I would say, even, anyone that does some sort of sales is taking that same risk too. They're an entrepreneur, because their commission is like that return on equity. And so, I think my point here is that, I think everyone at some point in their career is taking some sort of risk, and you should appreciate it and then see how you can leverage it.
Awesome. Well, Fhaeem, thank you so much. I feel like that's a really nice summary to your career, and just how you have touched so many different fields, in large part due to the people around you, your support structure, as well as your willingness to take risks. Those are the primary questions that we had from our audience today. Are there any final comments that you would like to make before we close out today's session?
No, I mean, I thank you so much for this opportunity. I would say, I think everybody has the skills to do this, to do anything in climate, not just climate finance. Everyone has the skill, the desire, and I think everyone understands the imperative to do their part for climate. And I think if we can all realize what our own skills are and what we can contribute, and come together as whether it's your local community or the global community, and build something together, I think is going to be really, really important. And don't see climate as a philanthropic initiative, or climate change as a philanthropic initiative. Just see it as is a global initiative. Like, this is something we just have to respond to right now. It's not an option. Like, it's here. It's not something that can sort of go away quickly. And it's gonna. I don't think there's any other time in history where we have to make such a long and profound behavior change, in our mentality and in our actions, to ensure that we have a comfortable life going forward, for the future generations to survive.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Fhaeem, for your final comments. And we will talk to you later. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.